Do you need a budget if you can pay all of your bills? What is the three-category budget? And how can you tell when your budget is successful? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 11th episode of the DoughRoller podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Welcome to day 4 of the 31-day money challenge. Yesterday, we looked at the net worth statement and how it affects and is affected by our budget. So for the next few days, we're going to focus on the dreaded B word, budget. It's something that in my past, at times, I've absolutely hated to think about. Today, though, I actually, believe it or not, enjoy budgeting, at least to some extent, enough to make it effective for our family. And so we'll talk about that. You know, a lot of times people look at budgeting a lot like dieting. It seems like, you know, it's all about denial. You can't have this, you can't buy that. You have to say no to everything. Today, I look at budgeting very differently. Today, I see budgeting as something that allows me to save and invest more money, which in turn brings me closer to financial freedom. And this really is the key, because budgeting isn't just about being able to pay all of your bills. Budgeting is about freeing up cash that you can use to invest. And today we're going to talk about 7 tips to effective and stress-free budgeting. Before we get to that, though, let me give a quick shout out to our 2 sponsors. The first is Betterment. Betterment's an online platform that invests your money for you, both in stock and bond ETFs. You just decide how much you want in stocks and how much you want in bonds. Betterment does the rest. It'll even rebalance your portfolio for you and reinvest your dividends automatically. You can check them out at betterment.com. And our second sponsor is Personal Capital. They offer a free online tool that allows you to aggregate all of your investment accounts, retirement and non-retirement. I use it daily. You can look at your asset allocation. You can look at the costs of all of your investments. It's a great tool. I highly recommend it. You can find them at personalcapital.com. Now, as we work through today's episode, I want you to forget everything you think you know about budgeting. You know, when most people think about budgets, what do they think about? Well, they think about, if you're my age anyway, you think about the envelope system, where you literally have an envelope for each category of spending, and you put a certain amount of cash in each envelope. And when the cash runs out for that month, you don't spend anything else on that category of expense. For some people, they think about tracking every single dime they spend from here to eternity. Really, I think when most people think about budgeting, they just think about pain and not having fun. And certainly budgeting takes some discipline, but you can, for today, throw out all of those sort of thoughts about budgeting, because really, that's not what it's about. In fact, some of the most effective methods for budgeting take little time, involve little stress, and don't require you to track every dime you spend in every category of spending. So let's begin. We're going to walk through, as I said, 7 tips for effective and stress-free budgeting. And we're going to start with tip number 1, and it's this: determine why you are budgeting. You know, if you recall in the very first episode, day 1 of this 31-day money challenge, one of the things I said is that we really need to question everything and begin with the end in mind. Ask why we're doing something. And that's as true with budgeting as it is any other area of personal finance. You know, it's certainly recommended by the experts that it's a responsible thing to do to budget. But really ask yourself, why are you budgeting? What is it you want to get out of the process? You could think of it this way. Ask yourself this question: if my budget is successful, I will be able to, what? Fill in the blank. Maybe the answer is pay your bills on time. Maybe the answer is avoid going into more debt. Maybe for you, if your budget is successful, you'll be able to save some money each month toward an emergency fund. Or perhaps you'll be able to save some money each month for retirement. Or you may be able to pay extra money each month towards a credit card debt. For you, a successful budget might involve several of those things, or perhaps other things. But before you take the time to actually budget your money, ask yourself, how will I determine when it's all done, when I look back at the last month, How will I determine if my budget was successful? If you don't do that, then you won't be able to track your success. You won't know if you're budgeting effectively. You won't know if you're budgeting, maybe your budget is overkill. Maybe for what you need to achieve, you can simplify your budget. So tip 1 is ask why you're budgeting in the first place. How will you know if your budget is successful? Tip number 2 is this. Budgets by themselves are useless. You must execute. Let me explain what I mean. And I think this story may resonate with a lot of people. But years ago, my idea of budgeting was this. Something would happen that that would motivate me. It was oftentimes I'd get the car insurance bill. It comes in every 6 months. And even though it comes in every 6 months on the same day, it would always surprise me. And it would put me in a bad mood, and I'd storm around the house. And that would motivate me, so I'd open up the laptop and open up a spreadsheet, and I would prepare this spreadsheet, and it looks something like this. The top column I'd have our monthly take-home pay, and then below that I'd have a row for each expense. I'd start with sort of our fixed known expenses that are easy to budget, right? Our mortgage, which is the same every month, and at that time, any other loans that we had. And I had a good idea of what our utilities were and our cable and our phone. So all those sort of monthly bills I'd list. And then I'd see how much money I had left over, and I'd start to think, well, let's see here. Got to have some money for food. We want to go out to eat every now and again, and there's going to be clothes and maybe some entertainment. And then I think, well, wait a minute. There's some periodic expenses that I probably need to cover, like the car insurance, which put me into a bad mood to begin with, and gifts at Christmas. And so I would sort of type out this spreadsheet in Excel, and I'd get to the bottom, and I'd subtract all these budgeted expenses from my income, and I might have hopefully a positive number at the end, maybe whatever it was. Maybe it was $500 a month. And I'd look at that and think, okay, that's okay. I feel better. And I'd close the laptop, and I'd go down and watch TV or whatever. And I'd forget the budget. It had absolutely no impact on how I made spending decisions throughout the month. I would often forget about it for months, probably until the next car insurance bill came in, and I just repeat the whole thing over again. And for me, at that time, my budgeting was totally useless. It may have made me feel good for a day, get me out of a bad mood because of the car insurance bill, but I never executed. It was totally, totally useless. And I don't know if anyone else has had that experience. I've talked to folks that have. And the same can be true if you use a fancy budgeting tool. It doesn't matter what tool you use, whether it's just like in my case at that time, I was just using a spreadsheet. You could use some paper and a pen, or you could use a fancy budgeting tool. The budget in and of itself is useless. It only helps you if it helps you achieve a financial goal. And so tips 1, determine why you're budgeting. How will your budget be successful? And tip 2, remember that you have to execute. Budgets alone are useless, kind of go hand in hand. And with those two then, I want to move to tip 3. And here we're going to start looking at some tips to actually help you do that. That is to execute on your budget. So tip 3 is simple. Pay yourself first. And you may have heard of this before in the context of saving. And the concept is this. When you get paid, you figure out how much you're going to save and save it right away. Don't wait to the end of the month to set aside money for saving, but save at the beginning of the month as soon as you get paid. And the idea behind it is by taking that money out of your checking account, you don't see it in there. You're not going to go spend it. Hopefully, right? It's gone. You've moved it to a savings account. Or perhaps into an investment account or retirement account, and it's out of your checking account. And it's helpful just really as a practical matter. I mean, I can remember times when I didn't do that, and I wanted to wait until the end of the month to save, and I'd look at my checking account, and I'd forget about that savings that I wanted to do, that money I wanted to set aside, and I'd think I had more money than I really did, and then I'd end up spending it. So that's the idea behind paying yourself first. But I think we can take it to another level. It doesn't just involve saving. You can use this concept in other ways. For example, if you're struggling with credit card debt and you have as your goal to pay, let's say, $250 a month extra towards your credit card debt. You don't need to wait until your credit card bill is due. When your check comes in, if you know that $250 of that check is going to go to your credit card, pay it right now. Pay your credit card first. Get that money out of your account so you don't spend it on other things. You can also apply this same principle to paying certain bills. As a landlord, I've dealt with tenants and I talk to other landlords. And one thing that I've seen is that tenants will oftentimes pay their monthly rent in two payments. They'll cut the rent in half and pay half in the middle of the month and the other half at the end of the month. So, for example, for January, they might pay half of it December 15th when they get paid, and the other half December 31st. These are tenants that are getting paid twice a month, and it's the same concept. You get that money out of your account. Yes, you're paying the rent a few days early, but you're taking away the risk that you're going to spend that money on something else. So this concept of pay yourself first, while it's generally used in the context of saving, you can really use it for a lot of reasons. Once you know what job you want to give your money, put it to work right away. There's no reason for it to sit in your checking account for a couple of days or weeks where you might end up spending it on something else. Tip number 4 is to budget monthly for periodic expenses. This kind of goes back to the car insurance example I mentioned a little earlier. There are a number of expenses that we have each year that don't come up on a month-to-month basis. Car insurance is one. In our case, we have life insurance that I pay yearly. Of course, there are gifts, whether it's Christmas gifts, holiday gifts, birthday gifts, anniversaries. These gifts come up periodically. They don't come up consistently month to month. Then, of course, if you take vacations, and it may be a week-long vacation in the summer, or you may have shorter sort of weekend getaways, but these all add up. And so the way to avoid the shock of these periodic expenses is to do this. It's to figure out first how much these expenses will cost you throughout the year and divide by 12 and put that money aside each month. Now, this can be a little trickier than it sounds. There are certain expenses where you pretty much know what the amount is going to be, like car insurance or life insurance. But then when it comes to things like gifts and vacations, it's sometimes easy for those expenses to grow and to become bigger than maybe you planned. And so for those, it really requires some careful planning, some real thought into what you're going to spend. And then when you get to the point where you're actually going to spend the money, to think back on your budget and to stay within that budget. It's not easy, but it can be done. And one thing that I do for all of these, whether they're expenses that are somewhat fixed like car insurance or variable or more discretionary like vacations, is I take the monthly amount that I've calculated and I move it out of my checking account. I don't want it where I can easily spend it. So I move it into a savings account. And then when it comes time for discretionary spending, like a vacation, I go back to the budget. I understand how much we've set aside for that vacation, and then I can, as my family plans for whatever trip we're going to take, we can work hard to work within that budget. Tip number 5 is to expect the unexpected. There are going to be expenses that come up, such as home repairs, car repairs, perhaps health issues, that are very difficult to anticipate. You know they're going to happen at some point, particularly as it relates to home and car repairs, but you don't know when and you don't know how much they're going to be. And so that can be intimidating. But the fact is, since you know they're going to happen at some point, it's important to start saving for them now as part of your budget. And frankly, your initial savings rate may have to be somewhat of a guess. Whether it's $100 a month, $200 a month, whatever it may be for you. And then over time, with experience, you'll be able to fine-tune that. But what you don't want to do is to completely ignore these expenses and then to be caught with a furnace that goes out, which happened to me a couple of weeks ago, for example, and not have the money to pay for it. I mean, it may be that you don't have all the money for the expense because perhaps maybe you underestimated or didn't think a repair would come up so quickly. But it's important to have something in your budget so that you can expect the unexpected. Tip number 6 is to budget for big items, and by that I primarily mean cars. I think it should be everyone's goal to pay cash for your cars. Now, when my wife and I got started out after college, there was absolutely no way we could pay cash for a car. It just wasn't possible. And so, like most people, we had car loans. But over the last 10 years or so, we've been able to pay cash for cars. And while it may seem impossible. It's really not with some work. And of course, it depends on one, how much you spend on your cars. But from a budgeting perspective, even when you have a brand new car, I think it's important to start setting aside money for the next car you're going to need to buy. And if it's a number of years out, that's terrific. It's just less you have to save each month. But by saving for that month to month, you'll actually build up a nice cash reserve so that when the time does come to pay for a car, you'll be able to pay in cash. The last car that we bought was a used Toyota Camry. I bought it in 2011 from a Toyota dealer. And I went in, and actually what I wanted to do was put the whole thing on a rewards credit card and then, of course, pay it off right away. But they had a limit. So I think I could only put $5,000 or $10,000 on my credit card. And then for the rest, I had my laptop. I went in, connected to the internet, and wired the money from my account to the car dealership's account. And I was talking to their finance manager, and I said, this dealership's in a fairly affluent area of Northern Virginia. And I said, I imagine a lot of people pay cash for cars around here, right? He looked at me, he goes, no one does. He said, in fact, you're the first person that's ever come in and wired cash to our account like this to buy a car, which surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't. But paying cash for a car is not impossible if you just prepare for it. And that budget could take a while. Maybe you won't need a car for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years. But by saving a little bit each month for that eventual big purchase, you'll have it when it's time. So the seventh tip and the final tip is what I call try the 3-category budget. And here's what I mean. For those of you that hate the idea of tracking every single penny in every single category, spending category, one approach to that is then don't. There's no reason to track every single category of spending. Remember, we want to focus on what the purpose of the budget is and what you're trying to accomplish and what successful budgeting will look like for you. And for a lot of people, I think they can probably narrow down to roughly 3 categories, those spending areas that cause them the most trouble. Maybe it's eating out or buying clothes or buying the latest electronic gadget. Whatever your weak spot is, that's where you need to really focus your budgeting. And so for a lot of people, I think they can, in some cases, maybe even just track 1 category, depending on your circumstances. But I call it the 3-category budget because I think for most people, they can narrow down their spending problems to 3 categories. But whatever it is for you, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or perhaps more, figure out where your weak spots are and seriously budget in those areas while letting the other categories go. For example, one of the things that we don't worry too much about is how much gas we put in the car. I mean, we go to work, we run errands, we do the things that most people do, and you get to the gas station and you fill it up. I can worry about every dime I put in the gas tank, but for us, that's just not an effective way to budget. On the other hand, for us, eating out can get out of hand from time to time, and I'm the worst culprit in our family. And so that's a category that I need to focus more on. That's the kind of category that can get us into trouble. So tip number 7 is try what I call the 3-category budget. Focus on those categories of spending where they give you the most trouble, where you can get the most bang for your buck by successfully budgeting in those areas. Well, I hope you found these 7 tips helpful. I think the key takeaway here is to recognize that there is no one right way to budget. What is best is what works best for you. And if you understand what goals you have for your budget, and then you can determine the best way to budget to meet those goals. And if your budget is meeting your goals, then it doesn't matter if it fits into someone else's idea of a good budget or whether it fits some traditional notion of tracking every dime you spend. As I said, I think most people can probably get away with just tracking a few categories. And there are some who just use the pay themselves first method. They just save a certain percentage of their income, and then they just spend the rest without close detail as to exactly where each dime goes. Again, if your budget meets your goals, then it's a success. So that brings the podcast to an end. Remember, you can find the show notes to this podcast at DoughRoller.net/podcast 11. That's podcast followed by the number 11. You can leave a voicemail message for me with a question or comment. Just go to speakpipe.com/DoughRoller. You can email me at dr@DoughRoller.net. I read every email, respond to every email. You can subscribe to this podcast. Just go to DoughRoller.net/iTunes. That will take you to the iTunes page where this podcast resides, where you can subscribe and leave a review. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Just go to DoughRoller.net/newsletter. There you can subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. It goes out every Saturday at 8 p.m., packed full of tips and resources to help you make the most of your finances. So until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.